Morning, it's Roger Lewis from Conquest of Doe and Grub Street Journal, and it is just coming up to 9:30 here in Sweden. I'm doing a screen capture of a four-part video essay which I've been putting together the last few days. Now, here's my browsing history. This is a Chrome browser, and I got up pretty early this morning. Here we go. Yeah, 3:30 I was up this morning, and I had uploaded or re-uploaded this overnight. It says page not found. We'll soon see about that. I think that's one that hadn't worked, and so now I've re-uploaded it. Okay, and it was this one here, 9/11 10 years on, which was is a BBC documentary made in 2011 on the 10th anniversary of the September 11th World Trade Center, Pentagon, and the Shanksville plane attacks on or in the United States of America. And there's this interview with Dr. Niels Harrit, which was done for this documentary. There are about, 2 minutes, I would say, of Dr. Harrit, and this is a 2-hour of all the takes of the interview, and it gives you some idea of how interviews can be edited into footage, and how narratives emerge from that. And this stream which I'm doing now, I'm just going to go through some of those narratives, and the title of this narrative is The Gatehouse, the Whole Gatehouse and Nothing But the Gatehouse, and that's named in honour of Gabriel Gatehouse, who is the BBC's international sort of troubleshooting correspondent. He turns up all over the world where all sorts of intrigues are happening, civil wars, revolutions, colour revolutions. He's been in Hong Kong recently. He's a pretty brilliant guy. He speaks Russian. His mother's half Swedish. He did an excellent documentary on Sweden a few years back about some of the narratives about Sweden. But we'll get to all of that. But that's the title of this of this stream. Now, this is the Hypatia I browser, and it's a customized browser in a start page, and it can be used within any browser that you care to use. I have on my machine the Chrome browser, the Dissenter browser, the Mozilla Firefox browser, the Tor browser, the Beaker browser, the Vivaldi browser, the Brave browser. This one here is a Chromium Iron browser. This is the Yandex, a Russian browser. This is the Pale Moon browser. This is another Chromium browser. There are lots of different browsers, and all of which, for various reasons, are actually better than Google Chrome. Your browser's one thing. Your next thing then is what you use for your search engine. So of course there's Google, and everyone, searching on the internet is now called Googling. But there are, you'll see here, different search engines you can use. Pale Moon, Waterfox, Speaker browser, the Freenet browser, Dissenter, Vivaldi, the Tor, the Brave, SRware Iron, Thunderbird, Yandex. I compute on Linux. I've been using Linux for nearly 10 years now, and I've used all sorts of distributions, but the distribution I use on this 2006 Mac Pro is Ubuntu 18.04 LTS, which stands for long-term support. So I've got a bunch of popular websites, news sources, weather, and so this browser can be shared, and there's a shareable link on my site, and you click on that and you basically then have all of the links which I've got on here, which includes some news sources which I use, others that I don't, like Bellingcat down here is here for a joke. I've got his RSS feed coming into here, so this is here for comedy effect. I've got Russia Today coming in, their RSS feed, but you can customize it to your own purposes. You could put the BBC there if you chose to, and so then I've got the Grub Street Journal here. That's the paper-Lee version of the Grub Street Journal, which is automatically generated based on my browsing history. Conquest of Dough is the novel which I've been writing, and this is the website supporting it, which has a lot of stuff about money creation history and geopolitics and stuff. And then this is my WordPress blog, which is not the Grub Street Journal, and it's on this blog which I've done the four-part series, which I'm just going to go through now. So that's Hypatia's iBrowser and the Grub Street Journal, which are a new form of publishing, which will be launching for publishing things like the Conquest of Dough, the Gollum 14 blog. David Malone is writing a number of things which I'm hoping to serialise on the Grub Street Journal. Ranjay Bakularan, man, who writes the London Conversation. There are various streams of Ranjan and I chatting about things, and the Slog, John Ward's blog, which is a brilliant blog, and covers current affairs and philosophy, and there's quite a lot of satire writing on there, hilarious things. There's a series called The French Letters, there's a thing called Saturday Smiles, and it really is a good read. So that's a little bit about the Hypatia's iBrowser. So let's just dig in, and this is a blog which I put up, which I'm just going to read the beginning of now, on October the 10th. What I've been doing is since March of this year, I've been recapping and reframing the Conquest of Dough novel, and as it's a contemporary geopolitics novel which goes back into history, it's kind of an emergent novel, but obviously when it's being serialised it can then be bought in full, but I'm hoping to launch that this autumn. The first 5 draft chapters are available to read and look at on the website. But anyway, I'm going to just read the beginning of this blog here. The New World Order Paradigm Shift. And then I've got these hashtags, and these hashtags are all to do with the idea of metadata and searching metadata, and how the Web3 will actually allow free speech and free searching of metadata in 2 directions, which is something I've been working on. You'll find quite a bit on the blog about. So the end of debt or the end of democracy. And what that means is that money is based on debt. Money is by definition debt. It's axiomatic. If you have money on one side of your balance sheet, you're going to have debt on the other side. Credits, debits, double entry bookkeeping. And my contention is we can carry on that debt-based way of going on, end that or end democracy. It's one or the other. And this is the idea of a debt jubilee, and debt jubilees happened every 7 years in the Bible, in ancient, all sorts of ancient writing. So, I noticed this exchange in the off-Guardian discussion about the Dummer and Doomer false flag attempted half-baked casus belli. What is the direction of travel and the main narrative embedded in the narrative of the past 40 years? The rules-based international order or New World Order narratives. 1. Globalization and urbanization. 2. Petrodollar hegemony, addiction to oil. 3. Man-made global warming. 4. Overshoot, overpopulation. And 5. Elitism, star-fucking worship of the elites. Page 34, chapter 3. This is Carol Quigley's Tragedy and Hope. Europe's shift to the 20th century. While Europe's traits were diffusing outward to the non-European world, Europe was also undergoing profound changes and facing difficult choices at home. These choices were associated with drastic changes, in some cases we might say reversals, of Europe's point of view. These changes may be examined under 8 headings. The 19th century was marked by belief in the innate goodness of man, secularism, belief in progress, liberalism, capitalism, faith in science, democracy, nationalism. In general, these 8 factors went along together in the 19th century. They were generally regarded as being compatible with one another. The friends of one were generally the friends of the others. The enemies of one were generally the enemies of the rest. Metternich and de Maistre were generally opposed to all 8. Thomas Jefferson and John Stuart Mill were generally in favour of all 8. Then I wrote a poem which I say is a cipher of globalism, and there's a trilogy of poems: Usury, Hell's Fuel, Man's Oppressor, Bourgeois Resolution, and Globalization Unentangled. And the first stanzas of Globalization Unentangled go like this. The idea before it was clothed in words, heard in minds as uttered thought, the communication of arranged ideas, thoughts lifting mist from the poet's page, to set the stage, not in the round, but to see the scene in the sphere. With actors will the playwright lay on the page's narrative to steer, which course to meet, who to set upon the bridge, for strength of bulls, Wall Street, of bears and onion domes upon our chart, a hero's pride found in Britannia's isles, monks, sans humilité, thanies, like Pope, we find our actors, all alike find reason on their side. Mais pas impatience de souffrir, on the present discontents, Burke opined. Putin, Trump and Farage set courses unentangled. Juncker, Merkel call for straight ahead. Few are the partisans of departed tyranny, of globalism or nationalism, which be the tyrant. Yet passions are deceiving someone. So near 50 years behindhand of hero fell. On this day, the day of March, in my opinion, is the end of the United States of America as the land of the free and the home of the brave. Eliza, with Rogerian inscrutability, hears the confession of the malcontents, a mirror held up before cosmetic application, globalization and internationalism confused. Despotism's nature is to abhor any, save that of its own momentary pleasure. It annihilates all intermediate situations between boundless strength on its own part and total debility on the part of the people. Our education can be our government. Our reason can be our judge of the rivals. Globalism authority, coercion and competition, or nationalism, internationalism, cooperation? Are we to have free will and democracy? Will we have determined authority? A struggle of ideals, an ancient quarrel, Parmenides or Heraclitus, navigators both? If centuries be epochs with peculiar discretion, 19th, 20th, 21st, a behindhand review, 19th, innate goodness of man, nationalism, 20th, fallen man, Calvinist rule, globalism, for the 21st, partisans for patronage. So, we move on to part 1. The full Gabriel Gatehouse, the BBC storyteller extraordinaire, the storytelling hitman, the story of PSYOP man, Grub Street Journal, not just the gatekeeper, but the whole fucking gatehouse. The gatehouse, the whole gatehouse, and nothing but the gatehouse. Part 1. And here is Gabriel Gatehouse's Twitter page, and you can see something of how the gentleman sees himself. It's all very mysterious. Gabriel Gatehouse, the BBC storyteller extraordinaire, the storytelling hitman. In the Star Chamber Court of the lies-based international order, our witness is sworn in to give the oath. I promise to tell the gatehouse, the whole gatehouse, and nothing but the gatehouse. Here are some interesting, seemingly unrelated news events and analysis of the same, fitting into the fast-moving news cycle, explaining the events which perhaps lack context, seem poorly understood, or could perhaps lead to wrongthink, thought crime, and other crimes and misdemeanours. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of those ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government. It would have been quite impossible to render this into newspeak while keeping to the sense of the original. The nearest one could come to doing so would be to swallow the whole passage up in the single word crime thing. A full translation could only be an ideological translation, whereby Jefferson's words would be changed into a panegyric on absolute government. That's from page 180 of 1984, the novel from George Orwell. And prior to that, at page 154 and 155, we have this. One does not establish a dictatorship in order to safeguard a revolution. One makes the revolution in order to establish the dictatorship. The object of persecution is persecution. The object of torture is torture. The object of power is power. Always, at every moment, there will be the thrill of victory, the sensation of trampling on an enemy who is helpless. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. Now, Gabriel Gatehouse is interviewing here Ian 56, Ian Schilling, and this was on Sky News at the time that all the Russian troll stuff was going on. I actually sent Ian a Twitter message saying, look, they're calling you a troll. I knew he wasn't because I follow his blog. Many people only know him through Twitter. His blog is absolutely great. This gives a juxtaposition of Ian's recorded questions with Gabriel Gatehouse and then what actually appears on the BBC. So here's the Russia's disinformation warfare Newsnight segment, and then the rest of this blog goes into a number of these Gabriel Gatehouse films, which are very entertaining and very good, but they fulfill a function, and the function of them is to support a narrative. And what we call narratives these days are what used to be called propaganda, or it's a way of manufacturing consent, to use the title of Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman's book, The Manufacture of Consent. So this is a film about Switzerland and its direct democracy, the cradle of populism. Direct democracy, that's democracy. Populism is this pejorative word that's used by authoritarian, deterministic, top-down elitist kind of narratives, and these are the narratives which come through from Mr. Gatehouse's work. So Switzerland, and then here is the list of Newsnight films by Gabriel Gatehouse, and you can see he's turning up in all sorts of places like Hong Kong recently, Myanmar not so long ago, Libya before that. Here's some stuff on Turkey, and then he did some stuff on Tommy Robinson and people who followed Tommy Robinson. This is a good film, Sweden, Truth, Lies and Manipulated Narratives. Of course it gives a narrative of its own. It's not unbiased, untainted by a point of view. And what I say here is, if you contrast this film with Pele North's film, Who Killed Olaf Palmer, which covers the same ground as Gabriel Gatehouse does there, and actually Pele North is half British and half Swedish as well, and is a brilliant writer who's written several great books, and not least the Who Killed Olaf Palmer. I mean, the Bible of Olaf Palmer assassination studies is Ollie Demigard's book, which is Coup in Slow Motion, which is over 1,000 pages long. It's worth reading, as is, I mentioned earlier at the beginning of this, Tragedy and Hope. Again, it's 1,000 pages long or whatever, but they do repay the reading. Now, so, and then this is a thing about the geopolitics of Sweden from the Caspian Report. This Caspian Report as well, should Finland and Sweden join NATO? And then this in here is Gabriel Gatehouse Believe in the Bin, and this bin joke between Gabriel and Rory Stewart here is also it's on a Joe. Joe is a popular kind of magazine online type thing, but it's like Vice magazine used to be. Gatehouse, gatekeepers, controlled opposition, all of these concepts, infiltration, agent provocateur, these ideas of keep your friends close and your enemies closer, infiltrate your enemies, rules for radicals, Saul Alinsky, all of these ideas of what's called statecraft, the Institute for Statecraft, something you'll hear a lot about if you click the link on the browser to UK column, for instance. What you see is the state doing a lot of the pot calling the kettle black, and all states do it. So here's the Meet the Tommy Robinson one, and so this whole blog goes through this thing. Now this is the Pandorama film. You can see on YouTube here. It won't embed. and you have to press a continue because people say they find it offensive. There's nothing to be found offensive about it unless you're John Sweeney, the BBC reporter who actually has his sting operation turned on its head back at him. Something that Donald Trump actually did as well. And then here's the information warfare and the Russian narratives things around the Sergei Skripal poisoning. Then this is a screen capture from there. This is stuff from the Ukraine. Here's Gabriel Gatehouse interviewing the former Prime Minister who was overthrown in the Colour Revolution, the famous Victoria Nuland aside, Nats or Yats is our man and fuck the EU, all of that stuff. Viktor Yanukovych, an oligarch himself, I think he made his money in chocolate confectionery or something, allegedly, or that's the backstory that is put out anyway. They look like they're having a good laugh and a joke there. And then what I say here, this is from the film The Long Short, and this is Vinny, one of the characters, and I said, be like Vinny, have no faith in the system, and that's a clip from there. And then basically I show some other narratives that come out of things like the LaRouche organisation, the LaRouche PAC, and this Australian organisation, the CEC of Australia, which is a small political party there that's considered to be alt-right, far-right or whatever. The LaRouche organisation, Lyndon LaRouche ran for president several times. He served time in prison in the United States. He's something to do with something called the Schiller Institute, I think, and he was an academic, and his wife's a well-known academic in that organisation too. And a guy called Webster Tarpley, he used to be there as well. He's an historian, and they give a different perspective on. I'm a Welshman, and I'm a British person. I'm a proud British patriot, and who we were, America before the British coup. Now, there's history between the United States and Britain. In fact, back in the 1930s, there were plans for the US to invade Canada and neutralise the British forces there. And when those plans came out, there were diplomatic incidents. Of course, we're told the story about the special relationship, and there are parts of the Anglo-American establishment that have a special relationship. There's another faction in the Anglo-British establishment that don't like each other, and I mean, oligarchies, like any political in-group, have factions, and competing factions naturally find that sometimes their competitive rivalries spill over into an active dislike for each other, and I think that's what we see at the moment going on. Our lords and masters, that I call the establishment, have been called the oligarchy. The oligarchy has got this power thing going on, and my contention is that the power dynamic going on is between groups in the oligarchy, some that want a one world government, new world order, i.e. a unipolar world, and I think that's the neoconservatives and the PNAC, the Project for New American Century people. Then there are others. The libertarians say that opposed NAFTA, and that general died. So Ross Perot, who ran against Bush and Clinton, I think in the 92 election, I think it was, way back when. Best president the United States never had, in my opinion. And Ross Perot, that faction is more sort of a non-intervention America kind of thing. It's difficult to see where Donald Trump fits in, because maybe even out of necessity, seems to straddle several camps. I don't, in some ways, you could paint President Trump as a classic American pragmatist, and of course, with this infighting going on with all the different factions in the oligarchy, being a classical American pragmatist would actually be a jolly good idea, I think. But there are lots of pulls from different directions, from different factions, and I think it makes the job of being the President of the United States quite a difficult thing at the moment. I think it's probably fair to say being the President of the EU is quite difficult, being the Prime Minister of Britain is quite difficult. Being the President of the Russian Federation as well. I mean, one of the really difficult jobs going at the moment is perhaps Iran and Syria. That's not an easy position to be in at the moment, because again there's a paradigm shift going on from an old monetary regime, which is known as petrodollar hegemony, and also a transition in terms of how we use energy and the networks of energy that are required to sustain how our geo-economical global kind of economy is sustained. It's my contention that that's where we see the climate narratives coming through, because what the financial elites want to do is replace the fiat dollar money, which is based on nothing. It came off the gold standard in the early 1970s after something called the Nixon shock. My contention is they're trying to move onto a semi-religious kind of footing linked to carbon, with carbon as a kind of a Manichean kind of foe, an evil thing, pollution. Of course, CO2 is nothing like, it's the gas of life, as it were. The king of elements, as carbon is known. Now, why does this transition in that direction need to happen? My contention is it needs to go in that direction according to the financial elite, because they want to continue to have debt, because debt does keep people under control. It is one of the main mechanisms by which a small group of people exercise dominion over the vast majority of everybody else. The old stories or narratives have worn very thin since the 2008 global financial crisis, and the financial elites have been trying to solve this since there was something called the Brandt Report in the mid-1970s, and the Brandt Report and various other reports that came out around 2008, including one from the chairman of the Bank of China. You'll find these all on the blog. Are looking at ways of structuring global finance, and the new way of doing it all started to be put in place contemporaneous with the NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, and the Maastricht Treaty in Europe. And the fight back against those from the common people of Europe, Britain and the United States was kind of brought to a head with the Brexit vote and the 2016 deplorables election, if you like, the one that Hillary Clinton lost. The Russians didn't lose it for her, she lost it herself. She was the most appalling candidate. And of course the Democrats seem determined to repeat the repeat the trick this time around. But the point about the drive over the past 40 years, which I started this part about, the drive since the early 1990s, so that's the end of the Bush 1 presidency into the Clinton presidency and forward, the end of the Thatcher premiership through to John Major, and then the Tony Blair 97 premiership through to Gordon Brown, and then obviously into the turmoil since 2010 when Cameron took over from Gordon Brown, and then the 2015 election, and all of the noughties, as it were, have been characterised by challenges against that, what I call a neoliberal push. And Gabriel Gatehouse, his job with all of his is to give a positive spin on all the neoliberal wars, and that's how I would say. And the LaRouche organisation is kind of a counter to that. So this is a blog I did called Gatekeepers, Double Agents, False Trails, the Topsy-Turvy Helter-Skelter to the International Lies-Based Order. And this is a sketch and the paragraph on the final note from the Unabomber. And this is another take, a primitive take upon modern ways of doing things. And then this is Cambridge Analytica, and then this is Gabriel Gatehouse's film on did Cambridge Analytica play a role in the EU referendum. And then I have there are various discussions that come out of that in terms of these narratives, and this is things like appealing to authority and the idea that we have to trust experts and that experts know what they're talking about and we should all jolly well shut up and listen, which was the sacking of Professor Bruce Charlton from a journal because he published a paper which challenged the link between HIV and AIDS. And these kind of challenges come through all the time with vaccinations, and people who challenge that narrative. And then this is anti-media, which is an interesting story about a alternative or non-mainstream media platform that was deplatformed off YouTube. And that we've entered an age of strong internet siloing, censorship, and trying to stop people from seeing the news that's consumed by other people. These are themes that you'll find running through the blog and in all of these examples that follow through on this part one. So it takes a long time to go through these, but this is the New Order song, and the song's Age of Consent, and that ends with this lyric: do you find this happens all the time? Crucial point one day becomes a crime, and I'm not the kind that likes to tell you just what I want to do. And that is an interesting comment upon retrospective criminality, and that's a big beef that we British people brought up on common law have with the European Union, which is founded on Roman law and canon law, whereby we have adversarial and presumption of innocence tradition, whereas they have a inquisitorial presumption of guilt there, and ne'er the twain shall meet. And of course, a lot of this idea of since Tony Blair with the Supreme Court and all the rest of it, the British institutions built around common law have been infected by, inoculated with, contaminated by top-down, centralised, expert-based ideals, and the flow of power from top down. Whereas, if we go back to the original quote there, the Orwell quote, let's just go back to that, and we'll wrap up on part 1 and go on to part 2. And we'll just go back to the American Constitution bit, and it's this bit here. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. Consent of the governed, very important. And that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of those ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of Brexit and the story of Make America Great Again. So, part 2, and so the Gatehouse, the whole Gatehouse, and nothing but the Gatehouse, part 2, and there's some more biographical stuff about Gatehouse, and then this book, The English, by Jeremy Paxman, which I really like. I read it when it was first brought up. So this is a write-up about it in the Daily Telegraph. And it's this is the introduction to chapter 1, the land of lost content. Ask any man what nationality he would prefer to be, and 99 out of 100 will tell you that they would prefer to be Englishmen. Cecil Rhodes. Now that kind of says it all. The Round Table, Cecil Rhodes, and that is the theme running through the whole of Tragedy and Hope, and in 1968, when it was published, Rhodes's vision of a unipolar world in accordance with his worldview, and Quigley's indeed elitist worldview, they thought that that was it, game over, and so the theory goes that Quigley, who was given access to all of the establishment's records and all the rest of it, and they wanted to say, look, what a job we've done. We have delivered nirvana for you. Here it is, the world we've made for you in our image, or in our world, the image of our worldview. And it's premature celebrations, really. So that kind of then leads on to giving further into Gabriel Gatehouse's worldview, or the worldview that he is charged with spinning and spooking, and this is a bit talking about he'd had a recent trip to Bangladesh, and he'd seen fleeing Rohingya people from Myanmar. Now, Myanmar, the story there are gas pipelines and oil pipelines, and China's need for energy, and where it gets it from. And back in the day, the president of Myanmar was lauded in the West as being this wonderful person, and now she's been found falling foul of the neoliberal requirements to starve the access to energy to China and Russia, or the export of energy from Russia to Northern Europe, Germany in particular, which goes against the particular faction in the American oligarchy, which is Texas Big Oil and an element of their financial oligarchy. And it's part of the Ukraine, and it's part of the serious story regarding export markets of hydrocarbons, and it's the access to the energy itself and the currency in which the energy is traded for. That's the backstory there. It's not the actual physical energy itself. There's actually a glut of gas and oil in the world at the moment. So whilst the peak oil theory, the jury's still out on that, with alternative energies and what have you, there is a glut of energy at the moment. So the peak oil doomsters and all the rest of it are kind of ahead of the curve, and this idea of extinction rebellion, that we're all going to fry and everything's going to be terrible really quickly, that's basically just hysterical nonsense, and it's hysterical nonsense which feeds into the sorts of narratives that Mr. Gatehouse peddles. And this is an alternative view on green policies and where they come from. This is Prince Philip, who famously said he wanted to come back as a virus so he could kill off all those horrible people. And then this is Kevin Galilee's exposition on the international system of depopulation and globalization, which it really is excellent. Then here is Richard Dawkins, who is a militant atheist, and this was his hysterical rant against Brexit. This is about the lies that led to the first Iraq War. The second Iraq War, that is. That's the weapons of mass destruction one. And so this goes through some of the subtext to the upfront narratives. This is an alternative view on some of the motivations behind the murder of Joe Cox, and a very interesting film on that from Richard Hall. And that's a scene from the Being There movie, Chauncey Gardner with Peter Sellers. It's a wonderful film. You can see the all-sighting eye and all the rest of it. Very, very good film. That's now here is the Joe thing, and this is Rory Stewart, and this believe in the bin thing. He wants to run for mayor. It's an in-joke, and Rory Stewart is famously a spook, and Gabriel Gatehouse is clearly takes his instructions from that kind of constituency, as it were, which is nothing unusual. There are lots of embedded journalists, if you like. I mean, the spookdom and mainstream media is hardly a controversial subject. This is Mogherini, the High Commission for Defence, and she's saying they've got a commitment to a more cooperative, multilateral New World Order. And that was last year sometime, taken from a UK column clip of her. GC Math, this is Big Pharma, and this is talking about the question that was asked by John Ruskin in Unto This Last. How would a doctor react to the panacea that cured all ills? And of course, with this, if someone comes up with an effective cure for cancer, which is fairly cheap, what does the industry around, cancer treatments and big pharma make of that? Well, the answer is it's not very popular. We have lots of those questions in energy and technology as well, and in terms of planned obsolescence and stuff like this. And the idea that the way that our current financialized capitalism works is a efficient use of everything to maximize profits it simply isn't true anymore. In crony capitalism, that simply isn't the case. And so the whole world of neoliberal economics based on their production function assumptions and all the rest of it, it's pretty low-grade bullshit, frankly. This is Ian Bone between Harriet Harman and this Conservative MP here, and he calls them both war criminals, and he's right. And the chairman of that discussion is actually David Starkey, the historian, who's been very, very interesting on the British Constitution and what's going on in the British Parliament at the moment. And this is a film I made set to the Stranglers' Rise of the Robots, and I call them Rustbots. And there's Ian there with his old avatar. Corbyn slagging off the Maastricht Treaty, a bit of an about turn. This is about COINTELPRO. There's the meme I made again with the Jefferson and the pursuit of happiness, etc. Complots of mischief. This is an interesting thing talking about conspiracies. It says that in fact, I forget how many times it is, but there's a famous Scottish philosopher whose name is temporarily escaping me, who mentions conspiracy rather a lot in one of his philosophical works, and it's only since the 60s and the Kennedy assassination that conspiracy theory has been given this pejorative kind of spin, and that's the 9/11 film and all the rest of it. Weak and Wobbly Cunning Plan. There's a lot about the Scottish referendum here, and an interesting film that was made about the sort of thing I'm talking about with Gatehouse. Revolution Not Televised. This is a guy called Lytton Crosby. We hear a lot at the moment. A guy called Dominic Cummins. There's a guy called Luntz who did a lot of the focus group stuff back in '95 when the Tories appointed David Cameron as their leader, and did a lot of work on the 2010 election for them. This is the Can't Be Arsed Fat Party. Brenda from Bristol, if you remember that. I wrote quite a lot about that at the time. The establishment didn't want a high turnout in the 2017 election, and there was one. In the same way, in the Brexit referendum, the turnout was high as well. So, Shillcott Report, again, that's relevant. This goes back to the 2016 primaries. This is when Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton was being challenged before the fix went in, and this was Melina Abdullah from Black Lives Matter basically saying we're not endorsing any kind of candidate. You know, these elections, they're not for us, they're all a show, is what she basically says there. War is a racket, Kakistocracy, and then this is my poem, Usury Hell's Fuel Man's Oppressor, chapter 5, The Conquest of Doe, or the draft of it, which is a satire on the buffoonery associated with some of the appointments made to the British government, etc. This is Super Competent or Super Smart Democracies by Roy Madron, and a series of films made there about neoliberalism. His book was about managerialism, elitism, globalism unentangled. That's the Rogerian Elisa's Inscrutability. Elisa was a interesting program that's mentioned in Hyper. What's it called? The documentary with the guy that made Bitter Lake, Hyper Reality. Anyway, that film, yeah. So that's that. It's a background film to my poem Bourgeois Resolution, which discreet charm of the bourgeoisie. It has a clip from there. It's very interesting, very funny. And then this guy here is a guy called Steve Jones, a geneticist, and he was singled out for special treatment in the Angry Harry blog, which is a men's rights blog, which I'd linked back in the day. Quite interesting, but this is a nature versus nurture thing that he gives. And this is Ken Mills' 1983 film Ghost Dance, which Jack the Reader famously makes appearances in. But that's a comment on it's a comment on double entry bookkeeping and basically how, depending on which side of the balance sheet stock is, once it's in the hands of the consumer, it becomes worthless. It's quite a powerfully made point there, which I've been quoting quite regularly. Then on to part 3. Part 3 of the Gatehouse, the whole Gatehouse, and nothing but the Gatehouse. There he is. You know, it says a bit about his background. This is a comment he made about the Manchester bombing thing. You'll find a blog in here about whether it was Theresa May's Reichstag fire moment back then, false flags and stuff like that. There's always a question mark, you know, 7/7, what happened? Again, we'll see in a minute where we're going. Some things to look at with that, to ask the question. So there's the spooky, that's the way he sees himself. Here he is again. And then on to part 3, propaganda, why the silly stuff works. Just as well whether Brexit or climate change, let's go round again. So why ridiculous official propaganda still works. 97% of practicing mediums agree that communication with the dead is real. Settled science. So official narratives, false flags, the official 9/11 conspiracy theory, NIST, comprehensive examination from the mainstream, BBC 9/11 documentary, Ganser, Harriet, ISGP, Wikispooks, Donald Trump. And so then this goes through a bunch, a kind of a narrative. This is my narrative now, which is a kind of a counter narrative, a sort of a counterpoint to the meter adopted by the establishment for Gabriel Gatehouse. I'm putting in my counter point, if you like, and there is dissonance, shall we say, between a worldview such as mine and a worldview such as his. And dissonance is quite an interesting term. It's a musical term, but it's also used in psychology in terms of cognitive dissonance, and we're headed in that direction too. Should Finland and Sweden join NATO? Pele North, who we mentioned earlier, very interesting on that question. And then these are some notes which I made when I was writing a longish blog back in August 2017, so you'll see that there are links to my notes or whatever. There's a long talk on YouTube given by Aldous Huxley, which is very interesting, and it goes into that. The Sri Lanka bombings, the recent bombings in Halle, the New Zealand shootings, or the shootings in Halle really. There are all sorts of violence being shown to us in the media, and obviously the establishment wants us to believe that we're all in a lot of danger, and of course if you're caught up in that sort of violence, you are going to be, but as Andrew Neil pointed out to the Extinction Rebellion activist the other day on the widely circulated interview that he did, he said that actually the number of people dying from extreme events 100 years ago was much higher than today, therefore the narrative is wrong, and that obviously remains as a question that we have to ask as to what are they really doing about stopping this violence. Bobby's on the beat, we say in England. You know, in the USA there's a militarised police force. Are they really, you know, they're busy chasing activists and being perfectly beastly to a whole bunch of people, rather than actually dealing with you know, gang members and all the rest of it. I mean, again, that's something that Donald Trump talks about, and he's told he's this terrible person. Whereas you've got Antifa, and Chris Hedges wrote a very, very good piece about Antifa, and so did Noam Chomsky, and Hedges was absolutely eviscerated for it. But he was right. These are people behaving like brown shirts, black shirts, basically fascists, yelling fascists at everybody else. This film about the Oklahoma bombing, on the Corbett Report. There we are. It's a bit more YouTube censorship. And then this is looking at the grand geopolitical strategy, how Brexit, Brian, the EU military unification maybe fits into all of that, and then oligarchical turf war on the energy access numbers racket, which is what I was just talking about. And that's the Joe Cox comparisons to Anna Lindh, who was another Swedish politician who was assassinated at the time, actually, of an EU referendum in Sweden. Olof Palme. Tina is there is no alternative, which is kind of the neoliberal slogan. This is Panama Papers, and this the theory that the reason that the far right laissez-faire politicians want Brexit is to make it Singapore off the coast of Europe, and casting the EU as this, well, we really don't like tax dodging kind of thing. The truth of the matter is they don't like tax dodging from the ordinary people that do all the work and create all the value. The oligarchs, they're not expected to do that. Of course, the big secret is taxes are completely unnecessary with the kind of monetary system that we can actually foster these days. And it's been that way since the 1930s. There's a guy called Beardsley Rummel, who was at the New York Fed at the time, who sort of busted the lid off that one. Elitists, W. Anchors, and all of this. This is heretics and burning books, and this is about Rupert Sheldrake and academic kind of censorship, as it were. War is a Racket, Smedley Butler, and so going through these counter narratives, the counterpoint to Gabriel's own worldview narrative. Then back in 2011 I did this blog called The Unified Theory of All the Corporate Bullshit, Lies, Damn Lies and Statistics, and I wrote down some notes at the beginning of it. Distinction, what things are and what things are about, contextual conceptualist, singular duality, duplicitous dichotomy, essentially ironic, plastic plurality, a busman's journey, selling coals to Newcastle, travellers gathering knowledge, tourists consuming. And then I did another blog back in August, Life Imitating Art, talking about Andrew Niccol and Stanley Kubrick and their films. And in this blog I actually have a passage about dystopian movies, including things like Soylent Green, but a number of others, which dystopian movies give some very interesting themes. Kubrick's work certainly, Niccol's work certainly, going all the way back to the 50s with Kubrick, but also things like Soylent Green, which was made in the 60s. Charlton Heston was also in another film in the 70s called something World. But things like The Truman Show and whatever, which is a Niccol movie.
The nail clippers where I put them back again. Sometimes
So that's the point there, which is that truth is stranger than fiction often, I guess we'd say there. And then this is a long blog that I did called The Semi-Establishment Pelagianism of Bremain, which goes into some of the belief systems behind deterministic views and elitist views of life, and libertarian free will, more views of life. So Pelagius versus Augustine in the Christian tradition. But it's also found in the Jewish traditions, and it's also found in the Islamic traditions. It's also found in the Eastern traditions. Philosophical stroke religious stroke what's it all aboutism, if you like. So 50 years behindhand, that's Edmund Burke line from These Present Discontents, and this is an ironic look at This is Radio Free Europe. And here we are, this is Internet Free Sweden. Except, obviously I always say that this is sort of the independent Republic of Rog in Sweden. There's a documentary called The Swedish Theory of Love, and I did a blog about that, which kind of gives my take on what the political economy of Sweden is, and it ain't socialist in my opinion. So let's just read this bit from Burke just to finish this bit. It is very rare indeed for men to be wrong in their feelings concerning public misconduct, as rare to be right in their speculation upon the cause of it. I have constantly observed that the generality of people are 50 years at least behindhand in their politics. There are but very few who are capable of comparing and digesting what passes before their eyes at different times and occasions, so as to form a whole into a distinct system. But in books everything is settled for them, without the exertion of any considerable diligence or sagacity, for which reason men are wise with but little reflection, and good with little self-denial in the business of all times except their own. We're very uncorrupt and tolerably enlightened judges of the transactions of past ages, where no passions deceive, and where the whole train of circumstances from the trifling course to the tragical event is set in an orderly series before us. Few are the partisans of departed tyranny, and to be a Whig on the business of 100 years ago is very consistent with every advantage of present civility. This retrospective wisdom and historical patriotism are things of wonderful convenience, and serve admirably to reconcile the old quarrel between speculation and practice. Many a stern republican, after gorging himself with a full feast of admiration of the Grecian commonwealths and of our true Saxon constitution, and discharging all the splendid bile of his virtuous indignation of King John and King James, sits down perfectly satisfied to the coarsest work and homeliest job of the day he lives in. I believe there was no professed admirer of Henry VIII among the instruments of the last King James, nor in the court of Henry VIII was there, I dare say, to be found a single advocate for the favourites of Richard II. So that's part 3. Let me just check how our stream is pushing out. Error. YouTube not receiving enough video. Oh dear. Right, I'm going to stop there, and I didn't hit record, which is very annoying.